accommodation that nobody in Ireland would be expected to live in. And I suppose in some ways there are conditions that we have to address, but we also have to address it in the context of the amazing other sectors of society, in terms of students, in terms of public housing, in terms of affordability, in terms of I suppose a home is not a commodity, but it's a home for life, and it's a home in which you live in. And for many of us, we've not had a home. So we are concerned about that. But we're also concerned that today 39% of travellers live in what can be called chronic, overcrowded conditions. You don't have access to basic services, water, electricity. Many families live in unofficial sites and account for 50% of the homeless figures. So when you're looking at that, you're kind of thinking, we're absolutely less than 1% of the total population in Ireland. And you have to say, why is that? Why is our community at the bottom? Why is it that they're the ones without water, sanitation, electricity? And why in a global pandemic, where people are, when the global pandemic arrived, we see that the COVID-19 was spreading, but it also meant that conditions needed to improve. So that didn't materialise in terms of the provision of safe, adequate accommodation. When the government talked about 2 billion, and you're saying there's 2 billion going to be allocated in terms of housing, you're saying, well, that's great that they're now invested. But then when you look at the accommodation in terms of travellers, 72 million euros ring-fenced for travel accommodation went unspent from 2018 to 2019. So why is that? That you have a budget, you have allocation, but you're not spending it. And what I'd be saying to the government inside is, that's absolutely shameful. It's not acceptable, and there's no way that that the government can stand over that in terms of the provision of accommodation. And I suppose our community, our situation is not getting better, it's getting worse. And when we talk about housing for all, it's housing for some and not everybody. And I suppose today I am absolutely angry by the very state in which people are homeless, and not only homeless, but people are absolutely dying on the streets. And that's unacceptable. So what are we doing? What are we doing in terms of the accommodation? So we're not just complaining, we're not just outside moaning and marching and shouting rhetoric. We're doing a lot. And what we've done is we have pushed for recommendations to be implemented. So we know what the solution is. And all we're saying to the government is implement the recommendations of the implement the recommendations from the expert report on accommodation. And if local authorities are not fit, if they're not able and tasked, and if you're not able, then set up an independent housing agency to oversee and monitor the delivery of traveller culturally appropriate accommodation throughout this Ireland. We also need to see Part 8 of the planning process, in which many local councillors object to. We want to see local councillors stop blocking the delivery of traveller accommodation, which is caused by discrimination and racism. And I think we have to call this out. It is institutionalised racism. Why is it that they are stopping the provision of traveller accommodation being built? It's absolutely unacceptable. And yet children are living in unhealthy conditions. And when we say unhealthy conditions, we're talking about children being hospitalised, becoming ill. We're talking about conditions that you just would not find in one of the richest countries in the world. It shouldn't be happening. So we also see the criminal trespass legislation. I'm coming to an end, but I just want to say that as a traveller, and I know in 2017 I stood outside Dail, not too far from here, in fact, in terms of traveller recognition. and we spent 30 years campaigning for that. But what we're also seeing is that we're not allowed to move as a nomadic ethnic group and have the freedom to move because we're restricted. And not only that, we're criminalised. So being on the road is in fact, can be seen as a criminal offence. And again, that is absolutely not acceptable. So we're calling for the Minister, Helen McEntee, to repeal the criminal trespass legislation and to ensure that is reviewed in the context of change, because that is absolutely important. So my final point is that we're in solidarity with everybody. And I know there was a Paddy from Donegal, and he was speaking. And I just want to say that, the situation in Donegal and other parts of the country is shocking. So we have to kind of step together and do something. And I think it's just amazing to see so many students out there. And I know that from year to year, we can see the accommodation and we see the news. But I think it's really important that we stand in solidarity, unity, and work together to bring about the necessary change. And all I'm going to say is, if you can give a big shout so they can hear you in there, and give them a big welcome back and say, House of for all! House of for all!
Homes for travellers! Not for profit! Homes for travellers! Not for profit! We stand with our brothers and sisters in the travelling community, and until their housing crisis ends, it doesn't end for any of us. And Bernard mentioned students, and while thousands and thousands of purpose-built student accommodation bedrooms have been built in the last few years, students have been systematically excluded from being able to access them because of the price. And we've all heard the stories in recent weeks of students trying to access accommodation, especially students in Galway, who have been faced with absolutely astronomical prices for 5-day. I think I heard something like €1,000 a month for accessing accommodation that's only available from Monday to Friday. It's absolutely disgraceful, outrageous, and should not be tolerated. Our next speaker is Beth O'Reilly from the USI. Homes for students! Homes for students!
So the USI are here today because the housing crisis in Ireland has escalated to the point where this is not a place for young people. Our students are at the mercy of a government who doesn't care, landlords who want to squeeze every last penny from us, and vulture funds who look at the future of this country and see only the potential to make profit. This housing crisis is a student issue, and it's an all-island student issue. From Cork to Belfast, there are thousands of students who should be excited about beginning the best years of their life, but instead they're booking hostel rooms, begging for accommodation on Twitter, or commuting across the country because they cannot find a place to live. In Galway and Waterford, we have students in hotels. In Cork, there are students deferring their year because they just can't find affordable accommodation. In Belfast, hundreds of students have been told that the accommodation was overbooked and there's just no place for them. And in Dublin, the city planning officer is so out of touch that all we get is luxury student accommodation. It's a kick in the teeth for every student walking home from their lectures to go past vacant and derelict buildings when they can't find an affordable place to live. Education shouldn't be a privilege for those who can afford to pay for it. The Department of Higher Education loves to talk about access to education, but how is 14 grand a year in student living expenses accessible to anyone? How can you access education when you don't have a bed to go home to after a day of lectures? You can't separate access to accommodation from access to education, and we can't fight for education for all without fighting for homes for all. The Housing for All plan offered nothing to student renters, nothing for students in digs who already have next to no rental rights, Nothing for HEIs who need capital grants so that they can build purpose-built student accommodation at an affordable rate. So at the end of our studies, when we've spent years struggling to find the money just to have a roof over our heads, why should we stay? Why should students stay in Ireland when the message they've been hammered with during their time in higher education is that they are nothing but cash cows for the higher-ups looking to make a profit? We are graduating into an Ireland we cannot afford to live in. It shouldn't be radical to think that everyone has a right to a home. We shouldn't have to shout and scream about this issue year in and year out when all we're looking for is something as basic as a place to live. We shouldn't have to beg the government to solve issues that their policies caused. But until this government makes meaningful, systematic changes that ensure that our students can have a safe, affordable and accessible place to live, we're going to keep shouting and screaming, and we're not going to stop until we make this the Ireland students deserve. Thank you.
What do we want?
Houses!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Houses!
When do we want them?
Now!
So a couple of people have said to me, there's no politicians here today, but there's actually a few, and we're going to have a couple of the good guys speaking, and there's a couple of them joining us now, and after that we're going to have a bit of music. So first I would like to invite Cian O'Callaghan, Social Democrat TD for Dublin Bay North, to address you.
Thanks, Tina. Firstly, I want to say, in relation to Mika and fire safety defects and pyrite and the billions of damage that have been done to people's homes and the damage and distress that have been done to people's lives, of going to bed not knowing if it's safe for your children in terms of fire safety, or your children seeing their homes falling apart in front of their eyes. This is not an accident. This is because the government and parties in there for years have sat by and known that they have a system of lapse, building control, a lack of independent inspection. They were warned for years this would happen. It has happened, and they failed to fix it. And that is a direct result of them siding with builders and siding with developers and putting people's lives as a secondary interest to that and not thinking of that. It's not an accident. And we stand strongly with everyone in Donegal and everywhere else that's been affected by that. I have to say, in my constituency, a lot of people have been affected by fire safety and pyrite issues. We know strongly what people in Donegal are going through, and full solidarity with you and everyone campaigning on this. I want to say in terms of the crisis we're in now, and we've heard from how this is affecting students and how it's affecting travellers. People with disabilities are also very much at the sharp end of the housing crisis. Migrants, people in low incomes. We have some of the highest rents in Europe, some of the most unaffordable housing. We have more than 8,000 people living in emergency accommodation. More than 120,000 households in housing waiting lists are living in insecure HAP tenancies. And in that context, what has the government done in their Housing for All plan? They have proposed in their Housing for All plan €1 billion in extra subsidies for developers. Now how can they justify the use of our public resources to give more money to developers and builders and investment funds? They are already spending €1 billion a year in subsidies for private landlords and investment funds, and they want to add more to that. And at the same time, in Housing for All, in terms of housing first tenancies that are needed for people who've lost their homes, who are sleeping rough, living in emergency accommodation, all Housing for All does on that is have 20 extra tenancies a year. That's it. That's as much as they could come up with in their big Housing for All plan. And that is not acceptable. We will not stand for that. So what we need is a tax on vacant homes. We need an end to all subsidies for developers. We need an end to the tax loopholes and favourable tax treatment for investment funds. And we need this money and our public resources to be put directly into building affordable cost rental and social homes that are needed. And we need to stand united in demanding that we get the housing that we need and that we deserve. Gorv Mágat.
Thank you, Cian O'Callaghan. In the constituency of Dublin Bay North this week, we saw something pretty sinister happening, which was that these posters that you can see here at the front of the stage that were being put up to advertise today's demonstration were being taken down and replaced with a sign that had a pretty toxic anti-migrant message on it, which I'm not going to repeat now. But what we want to say today is that we want to blame the vultures and not other cultures. Blame the vultures! Blame the vultures!
Not other cultures!
Blame the vultures!
Not other cultures!
As all the speakers have said so far, this is about housing for everybody, and we stand with all of the communities at the heart of the housing crisis. The people are not to blame, it's the people in the Leinster House who are to blame. So another politician for you that I think you prefer to be known as an activist. Richard Boyd Barrett is certainly somebody who gives the people in the big house a good run for their money.
Thanks, Tina. Look, it says it's kind of depressing, to be honest with you, to see such a brilliant demonstration of people out here who care about an issue that is affecting hundreds of thousands of people in this country, which is an urgent crisis, emergency. It's a priority for ordinary people. But because we have a government that is more interested in getting jobs for their mates and cronyism, day one of the Dail is dominated by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael circling the wagons to protect a minister and protect his job, rather than deal with something that actually matters, like putting an affordable, secure roof over the heads of people in this country who desperately need it. And you see, that is the shame of it, because there is nothing more basic for anybody to live and exist and participate in our society than to have a secure, affordable roof over their head. And it is surely the most damning indictment that is possible of any government that we live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with economic growth rates which they boast about week in, week out, and yet hundreds of thousands of working people, of travelling people, of migrants, of students, or people in Donegal and Limerick and Mayo who sweated to put a roof over their head do not have a secure, affordable roof over their head. What a damning failure of the system. But what I really want to say, and Cian O'Callaghan has already alluded to it, none of this is a mistake. None of it is a mistake. It's not incompetence. It's not an accident. It's not that they got a few things wrong. It is a deliberate consequence of their priority of putting the interest of developers, of vulture funds, of profit-hungry bankers and builders ahead of the needs of ordinary people in this country. When the history books are written, when the true history of the last decade or so is told, what they did with NAMA, for example, will stand as one of the greatest heists, one of the greatest lootings of the resources of the people of this country in the history of this state. We once had in public control, just a decade ago, in state hands, the biggest property portfolio of any company in the world. That's what NAMA was. And we pleaded 10 years ago with them to use that property, those buildings, those assets to provide housing for the people who needed it. Because we had a housing crisis then. Instead, they flogged off 43 billion worth of property and land assets to the very vulture funds and developers and speculators who had caused the crash in 2008. It's a scandal beyond scandals. And that scandal, despite all the rhetoric of housing for all or rebuilding Ireland, continues. And to me it is just summed up by the fact, something I didn't know all the details of, although it's very apparent if you look around the skyline of this city. Look at all the hotels that are being built. Look at them. We have had massive amounts of hotels for profit being built. There's going to be another 25 hotels, nearly 5,000 bedrooms built in the next 3 years alone. That is a 50% increase in the number of hotels that were built in recent years. All of it built for profit. You know, when they say, oh, we don't have the building workers to build the houses for people, that's because they're all building hotels for international property investors. And then students who can't get affordable accommodation are having to pay €400 a week to stay in those hotels. It's a scandal. And then that infection of profit-driven development is now spreading into the college campuses. UCD building so-called student accommodation for €14,000 a year. That is absolutely shameful. In publicly funded universities, the universities and the colleges are getting in there on the act. They're copying the madness that has created the housing and rental crisis in wider society. And the government facilitates all of this every step of the way, giving them the planning permissions, giving them special fast tracks to get stuff built. And of course that explains the MICA stuff as well. These profit-hungry builders and developers were just let run riot. They removed all the regulations. It's not that they didn't have the regulations. We used to have regulations on building. They removed them in order that their developer and builder friends could make more money and build stuff that was guaranteed to fall apart. And God knows we probably have only seen the tip of the iceberg of some of the rubbish that was built in this city and cities across the country over recent years. So it hasn't stopped. And I'll just conclude by saying this. When they are addicted to protecting the interests of profit, people who are willing to make money from the housing misery of hundreds of thousands of people, the only people who can do anything about it are you people here. The travellers, the people from Donegal, the students, the working people who are priced out of the market. We have to rise up and demand that secure, affordable housing is a basic right for every human being in this country. Thanks very much.
Vultures, vultures, vultures! Vultures, vultures, vultures! Vultures, vultures, vultures! Folks, there's an incredible turnout today and an amazing variety of groups and signs. So the journalists that are over here have asked me, will you all hold up your signs so that they can take a picture representing all of the issues, all of the groups. Raise them high like we're going to raise our voices over the coming period. Vultures, vultures, vultures! Homes for people! Homes for people! Homes for people! What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? Okay, next up is music from the Resistance Choir. A few songs and then a few more speakers. We're going to hear from tenants. We're going to hear from homeless services.
question.
We're really part of the choir.
Okay, folks, the resistance choir.
Gonna let no evictions turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. They're gonna let no evictions turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Gonna let no landlords turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. They're gonna let no landlords turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Gonna let no bankers take me out on the streets, out on the streets, out on the streets. They're gonna let no bankers take me out on the street. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Gonna let no minister deny me a home, deny me a home, deny me a home. Ain't gonna let no minister deny me a home. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Gonna let nobody die on the streets, die on the streets, die on the street. Ain't gonna let nobody die on the street. We're gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Minister O'Brien, tell me what have you done? What have you done? What have you done? Minister O'Brien, tell me what have you done? Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. I'm gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching till they build us a home. Marching till they build us a home. Marching till they build us a home.
I've been US got 450 second hand. I love them. It's not to value shit. If you knew how to value, you would have paid. You know, you would have had me paid double. But like, I let my direction wait someone to be using a lapel like just having a name after.
So the resistance choir believe that music and song is a central element of protest, and they're always looking for new members in the choir. So if you want to sing and dance your way to the revolution, then join the resistance choir. We're just turning up the volume, folks.
You got to say, Tina.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes refugee. Sometimes I feel like a refugee. Sometimes I feel like a refugee. 'Cause we all need a home. Tell me now, what's this government done? Tell me now, what's this government done? Tell me now, what's this government done? 'Cause we all need a home. Yes, we all need a home. So rise up. Don't take anymore. Rise up. Don't take anymore. Rise up. Don't take anymore. 'Cause we all need a home. 'Cause we all need a home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.